Welcome to The Cow Behind the Barn, a podcast exploring humanity, the world, and the divine as experienced and interpreted by an artist. I'm Kevin Caldwell, a co-founder of the Table Collective. Well, if you've been following the podcast weekly, you know that what I thought was a simple question, where and when did I begin, opened into much bigger questions about space, where, time, when, and consciousness, I. Along the way, I've been referring to something I call psychic entanglement, which I came up with through reflections on quantum theories of the nature of the universe and space and time, and several initial samples from religious texts. My understanding of psychic entanglement suggests, among other things, that space and time and consciousness are all intertwined and entangled with themselves and between themselves. It's impossible to separate them neatly into episodes, though I have been trying as best I can. After some autobiographical reflections on my own entanglement with some of my wares, which I hope prompted you as a listener towards insights of your own, I got to a spot near the end of the last episode at which I said I would begin looking more deeply into what some of the great religious heritages have to say about space, the nature of the physical world. And here I am. However, to be honest, for some reason I thought summaries from various religious heritages would suffice for my purposes, like a Judeo-Christian Islamic version of the world could maybe be covered with, in the Judeo-Christian tradition and Genesis 1 there are phrases like, in the beginning God created, and the Quran has similar references. Or turning to Buddhism, that it'd be enough to say the only universe compatible with Buddhism is a cyclical one without beginning or end. And then there's the religious heritage of science that could be covered with something like, there was a Big Bang 13.7 billion years ago, although now they say 13.82. Little summaries like 8-ounce drinking glasses. I should have known better. And the more I drank, the more deeply I wanted to drink. I've said frequently that as an artist, I see religions as forms of art and the founders and shapers of religious traditions as spiritual creatives. As such, I find each of the religious heritages have been giving me water to drink that helps me imagine the world. And in doing so, they help me to see it through rich, mythic, epic, archetypal images and themes which conjure profound ways of experiencing the world, not just thinking about it. And this applies equally, by the way, to the scientific imaginative heritages as much as it does to the others. All of these heritages can provoke our creative imagination as a way of knowing, and no distilled summary of them, such as I had imagined doing, can do them justice. Therefore, since I can't fit fuller treatments of them all into the size of a single episode, I'm going to divide them up. Chronologically, basically. In this episode, I begin with the Bhagavad Gita, the Buddha, and Lao Tzu. The next episode, I plan to move to the Judeo-Christian Islamic ways of seeing the world, and then I'll turn to what I see as the epic mythology of theories of the universe being explored in recent years in various fields of science. Before all of that, I actually want to pause and set my own internal posture, a way to approach everything with my whole soul before turning to more of a headspace to describe what the heritages have to say. So I'm going to offer first a not yet released to the public instrumental piece that I created. I titled it Lao Tzu's Theme because it was my meditations on his poem, the Tao Te Ching, which inspired this piece. I invite you to listen in that same spirit, the spirit of it being a meditation, perhaps calming your body and opening your palms, perhaps physically, as an expression of willingness to just be and to receive. Be attentive to your breathing and that sort of thing as you listen to this piece, Lao Tzu's Theme. Thank you. Now I proceed to see what the Gita and Buddha and Lao Tzu might say about this where in which we live. I begin with the Bhagavad Gita because it comes first chronologically. In chapter 7, starting with the 4th verse, Krishna says to Arjuna, "The 8 components of my material energy are earth, water, fire, air, space, mind, intellect, and the surface self. Besides this material energy, O mighty armed Arjuna, there is another superior energy of mine, which comprises the living entities who interact with and make use of the resources of this material world of nature." Now, let me pause for a moment and comment on a few terms in that passage. First, there's Krishna, and Krishna is an avatar of Vishnu, the god of love, compassion, protection, tenderness. Then there's reference to material energy, which is Prakriti. I've referred to that in a prior episode as well. It's nature as we experience it. It's a manifestation of Krishna, or of the divine, if you prefer, though a manifestation that we receive incompletely because of our typically inaccurate perceptions of the material world. There's mention of 8 components. Now, 8 may seem complicated enough, though later in the Gita we learn that there are actually 24 categories. Surface self. Some translations refer to this as ego or false self. I render it this way because this self is one of the aspects of nature, so it is natural. It's only a false self if we remain in the illusion that it's our only self, or the only true thing about ourself. For there is a deeper self, in contrast to what I have called the surface self. Now, going back to the Gita, I'm going to render more verses from it in a sort of poetic blank verse version of my own. Krishna goes on to say, "I am the womb of the entire creation. It comes from me and dissolves again in me. Everything rests in me as pearls strung on a thread. I'm the taste in water, the radiance of the sun and moon. I'm the sacred syllable Om in the mantras of the Vedas. I'm the sound in the air, the possibility of action in human beings. I'm the pure fragrance of the earth, the brilliant glow in the fire. I'm the life force in all beings, the religious rigor of the ascetics. I'm the eternal seed of all beings. I'm the intellect of the intelligent, the splendor of the glorious. I'm the strength of the strong, though without the desire and passion to possess. I am sexual activity in keeping with virtue." Now, the above could be read as if Krishna, at a single point in time, clothed himself in and now wears the world, and that there is only one such world. In fact, it's much more mysterious. First, there's innumerable cycles of creation and dissolution, eternal, without beginning or end. And second, commentaries on the Gita refer to universes, plural, 14 whole worlds and planetary systems, according to some. Universes upon universes in eternal cycles. Now hold that thought, and we'll proceed to the Buddha. The teaching of the Buddha is often passed on through narratives in which he responds to questions. There are 14 questions, however, that he refused to answer, and 2 of those were the questions, is the universe eternal or not eternal, or both? And is the universe infinite in space or not infinite, or both, or neither? The Buddha viewed such questions to be inquiries about things we could not know, and so speculation about them is similar to what we might call fairy tales. things that he would say were just a waste of time to think about. He refused to answer such questions because seeking knowledge about the origins and nature of the world would not lead to liberation from suffering. So he had two reasons not to answer them. One, we can't know, and two, they don't help us. Because the Buddha was focused on what could be known and on the discovery of the practical process of liberation. However, in the Aganya Sutta, Buddha did tell a story of creation in the course of conversation with two of his followers. He'd asked how they were doing, and they told him that they were being criticized because, as higher caste Brahmins themselves, quote-unquote, born from Brahma's mouth, they should not be associating with beggars, people of a lower caste who had been, quote-unquote, born from Brahma's feet. In response to that question, and its clearly mythical elements in my point of view, Buddha told a story, which is sometimes called a creation myth, though in fact it's less about creation and more about the refutation of castes. I think he uses a mythical tale of his own to counter a mythical tale. He employs an artistic form to describe the truth of the common origins of human beings. Listen to it with your imagination, your senses. Buddha began, Brahmins are born of women like everyone else, and that's the fundamental point, the verifiable, practical truth typical of most of Buddha's observations. But then he continued with the mythical account. Quote, when a cosmos comes to an end and contracts, and before a new cosmos begins, there are luminous beings who live for a long time, feeding on delight itself. During this state, there are no suns or stars, planets or moons. As such, one contraction ended. An earth formed, beautiful and fragrant and sweet to taste. Those who tasted the earth began to crave it, gorging themselves, and their luminescence disappeared. The light that left their bodies became the moon and sun. And by the way, let me interject here, note the mythical way of referring to what I've been calling entanglement here. Back to Buddha. In this way, night and day were distinguished, and months and years and seasons. Their bodies became coarser. Some of them were handsome, and they despised the ugly ones and became arrogant, and as a result, the sweet earth disappeared. Then a mushroom-like fungus grew, and it was sweet. They began stuffing themselves again, and their bodies grew even coarser. The more handsome ones grew arrogant, and the fungus disappeared. Then they found sweet creeping plants with the same result. Then rice appeared in abundance, and whatever rice they took for a meal would replenish itself before the next meal, so there was always food for everyone. During this time, their bodies developed sex organs, which led to lust and craving, and those who engaged in sex were despised by the others, and they were driven out of the villages. Then the exiles built their own villages. The beings who had given in to lust grew lazy, and they decided to not gather rice at every meal. Instead, they would gather enough rice for 2 meals, or 5, or 16. But the rice they were hoarding grew moldy, and the rice in the fields stopped growing back as quickly. And I'll interject here, I'm noticing entanglement again, the way human actions affect nature in this case. Back to the Buddha. The rice shortages caused the beings to distrust each other, so they divided up the fields into separate properties. Now the story concludes by describing how in that separated, disconnected state in different villages and separate properties, people formed together around specific areas of specialty and expertise. The castes, warriors, tradespeople, etc. But that takes us back to the main point that the Buddha was making, that everyone was actually born the same way. The castes resulted from the craving of human beings and not from destiny. Through his art of storytelling, using images of sweet earth and fungus and mushrooms and luminous beings of light, the Buddha provides a powerful imaginative way of not just telling us, but of inviting us to experience imaginatively how deeply woven into human suffering craving is. That theme is woven throughout the tale. Now, what about the nature of the world? The myth above is a narrative way to speak of the interconnection of everything. For example, planets result from the light of people, which departs due to their craving, and thus we're entangled with the planets. There are other suttas in which we find more of Buddha's fundamental concepts, some of which also show up in his narrative way of presenting those truths in the Aggañña Sutta. So he's presenting the same concepts in two different ways, one more didactic and one more narrative and mythical. But here's some of the key points. Everything is caused by other things. Nothing is created independently by a God or nature or fate. The world is a vast flow of events that are linked together and participate in one another. Things exist only in relationship to other things. Nothing has an independent, autonomous existence. Humans depend on nature. Nature depends on humans. There is no beginning of everything, if by beginning we mean an independent, autonomous first cause, a big bang, a creation ex nihilo, or out of nothing. Any version of such concepts would require including some degree of interdependence with something else in the Buddha's thought. Both the Gita and the Buddha's teaching agree that there was no single creation or beginning, that the universe is created and destroyed in a cycle of never-ending cycles. And both are also expressing in different ways something very close to what I've described as both physical and psychic entanglement. So the Gita talks of humans who make use of the material energy of the world, engaging it with their minds, among other ways. And for the Buddha, things exist only in relationship to other things, and our perception of the world and the world we perceive are impossible to distinguish, or, in my own words, our perceptions create it. But either way, in the end, everything is entangled. I've selected one more source, and I'll turn to it now in this episode. Lao Tzu. Lao Tzu lived in China in the 6th century before the Common Era. He's attributed with being the foundational figure in the formation of Taoism and the author of one of Taoism's source texts, the Tao Te Ching. It's an 81-stanza poem which describes the nature of the Tao and how to live in keeping with it. It's a term that's usually translated as the way, but it's a very difficult term to render in English. In fact, the concept wasn't easy for Lao Tzu to define in his own language. The poem, in fact, opens with these words, stanza 1, "The Tao that can be told is not the eternal Tao. The name that can be named is not the eternal name." In other words, if you can define it, then it isn't it. Now, what does the Tao have to do with the world? Also quoting from stanza 1, "The nameless is the origin of heaven and earth. The named is the mother of 10,000 things." Mysterious. Well, stanza 42 opens with this. "The Tao is the origin of one thing, which is the origin of two, which is the origin of three, and so on to 10,000 things, which hold and carry the yin, or inaction, and the yang, or action. And she is the harmony of it all." We could call she the life force, breath, being the harmony of it all. The Tao is not a thing or the sum total of things. It's the source of all that we've just named. It's not a static source that we can objectify as if it were merely another type of thing. The Tao is the origin of the world we know, an origin which is the process by which things come into their thingness. Lao Tzu sees ultimate reality, in other words, as process, not a process, but process itself is reality, a constant, generative, creative process resulting in the world around us, which is a constant movement between something and nothing, as we find in stanza 40. Everything, all things, come from something, or yu in Chinese, but the something comes from nothing, wu in Chinese. In stanza 51, the Tao is not the result of following a command, it is simply natural. For the Tao begets and keeps all things. It fosters, nurtures, sustains, nourishes, shelters them. Although there are expressions in Lao Tzu's poem which sound as if the Tao is personal in some way, the Tao is not a being and so not a god. Some commenters or commentators describe it more as a force, and yes, Star Wars fans, There are a lot of similarities with that force and a lot of differences as well. But again, the Tao is nameless and formless. If you can name or define it, then what you've named or defined is not the Tao. Now, neither what I've quoted from the Tao Te Ching nor my attempts to summarize it here provide much in the way of actual content or detail. And that's actually in keeping with the approach of Lao Tzu, who elsewhere says that what really matters is not what is said, but what is not said. However, like many spiritual heritages, in some streams of Taoism, there are more explicit stories about how the world as we perceive it comes into existence, and what it's made of or what it's like. Here's one such story in a summary form, and I think you'll notice how elements from the Tao Te Ching show up here. But it's done in narrative form. In the beginning, there was an endless void known as Wu Shi, combining a word, Wu, sometimes rendered as nothing, and a word, Shi, sometimes rendered as breath or life force. It came to mean the primordial universe and came to be understood as equivalent with the unmanifest Tao, the unseen, unexperienced Tao. As Wu Shi manifests in the world, it divides into two, the yin and the yang, which are complementary conditions of action and inaction. This stage represents the emergence of duality and polarity out of the unity of Tao. The dance, the continual transformations of yin and yang, fuels the flow of Shi, that is, life force or breath. And this life force or energy or principle is in constant transformation between its material manifest state and its energetic unmanifest state. In other words, it's something or it's no thing in the poem. From this dance of yin and yang emerges the five elements of all things of the world: wood, fire, metal, water, and earth. Compare that list to what we saw in the Gita is interesting. From those elements come 1,000 things, representing all of manifest existence, all the objects, inhabitants, and phenomena of the world that we experience. We human beings are among those 10,000 things, not something separate from the natural world, but another manifestation of it. This is all foundational to the idea that the Tao is the natural flow of the world. We might say it's just the way of things. And so in Taoism, the aim of life is to live in keeping with the Tao, in keeping with the way things work naturally. The dance of opposites, action, inaction, nothing, something, opposition, unification, etc., creates a dynamic balance between manifest and unmanifest, or known and unknown, seen and unseen. The Tao and the 10,000 things arise in a perpetual interdependence of all of that. Or, to use the term I've coined, in Lao Tzu, the world and all that is in it can be described as a universal cosmic form of entanglement. Now, let me try to summarize what all this says about the nature of the where we live. In the Gita, the world or worlds is or are eternal, cyclical, entangled with big S self and with all small s selves. And to note for later, that big S self is in many places personal or suprapersonal in the Gita. From the Buddha, the world or worlds is or are eternal and cyclical, entangled with small s selves via perceptions and experiences of it. In Buddha's teaching, either there is no personal big S self or selves, or what we know of them is enmeshed in delusion and illusion, and thus we can't really say anything certain about them. Or it's possible that it's all just purely speculative and thus beyond Buddha's much more existential and practical primary focus. According to Lao Tzu, I'm not sure if Lao Tzu would say that the world is eternal or if it had a definite beginning in time, but the nature of the reality which is the source of all things is generative process. Things, places, the world as we know it, all of it is a result of that generative process, similar to the cycles that Buddha and Gita talk about, perhaps. Everything is sustained by it. All things are part of the dance between no thing and something. Is the Tao personal? Lao Tzu speaks of the Tao as mother in places, but I think based on everything else in the Tao Te Ching that he does say, he's using terms like mother and shelter and those personal references probably in a more metaphorical sense. All right, well, there are differences between the three heritages that I've been exploring here, but what they share in common is what I've described as entanglement. But in the course of the episode, other themes have been sneaking in. For example, to say that the material world is eternal is introducing the idea of time. To say it's cyclical, entangled, enmeshed, interconnected with itself and with mind, quote unquote, and human perception, and in the case of the Gita, with the big S self, is taking us into the arena of consciousness. And I'm trying not to go to those places yet. It just seems fitting here to make mention. One thing that is clear is that these three heritages share a very different view of the physical world than the Judeo-Christian Islamic heritages, and also different than what Western science, as assumed until much more recently, has presented for us. In fact, these three spiritual creatives, the Gita, Buddha, Lao Tzu, actually share a great deal with what developments in quantum physics and astrophysics suggest about the world we live in. And we'll get there. But before leaping to that conversation, I've got some other religious traditions to visit. As I prepare to wrap up the episode, I want to pause again. I want to return to the same music I shared in the opening portion. Sort of like participating in the cyclical nature of reality, I suppose. But this time, not just as a general invitation to receptivity, as I did then, but now, having heard all that we have about the nature of the world around us through the imaginative ways of seeing inspired in us by the Gita and Buddha and Lao Tzu, while hearing and experiencing the music, I want to invite us to allow ourselves to imagine the world. Or if you're outside, actually just see it and be attentive to it. Maybe go outside as you listen. Either way, I want to invite us to enter the world and the music together and experience this world which is our where. Here's Lao Tzu's theme again. In the next episode, we'll turn to the Judeo-Christian Islamic heritages. And depending on where you're located, that means we'll either be moving to the west or to the east. Until next time.